Stay behind me." The voice was low, hoarse, but it cut through the ringing in her ears with the decisiveness of a blade. Lyra froze, her high heels digging into the asphalt less than a yard from him. In that suspended moment, she finally understood. The men hired to protect her, the men her father vetted, were looking at her not as a principal, but as prey. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of gasoline and the acrid chemical scent of burnt leather wafting from the overturned black SUV. 3 men in dark tailored suits methodically drew their firearms, their movements smooth and practiced. The man standing in front of her, however, the one whose white shirt was stained with dust and a disturbing amount of blood that wasn't his own, had only his bare hands. He wasn't her bodyguard. He was just the temporary driver, a single father who had only taken the job 3 days prior. Yet the way he planted himself between her and the threat, the sheer solidity of his stance, and the unnerving calm in his eyes, as if he were staring down a house fire, not firearms, made her feel genuinely safe for the first time in her adult life. From the distance, the faint wail of police sirens grew closer, a promise of help that felt impossibly far away. In front of them, the first bullet hissed through the air, striking the metal chassis of the wreck, and the agonizing question burned hotter than the flames. Why did her own father's security detail want her to disappear? Lyra Hale had been back on home soil for exactly 72 hours, and the silence was already deafening. New York, with its chaotic symphony of sirens and strangers, had been her escape for 4 years, a place where her name meant something, but not everything. Here, back at the Hale Vision estate north of the city, her name was the only thing that mattered. The sprawling grounds were manicured to perfection, the glass and steel home a monument to her father's technological empire. And to Lyra, it felt like the most expensive prison in the state. At 27, she was the sole heir to Hale Vision, and her father, Elias Hale, never let her forget the weight of that title. He was a man who communicated through directives and security protocols, and his love, if it existed, was buried deep beneath layers of impenetrable corporate armor. This return, however, was different. It felt less like a homecoming and more like an extradition. A minor incident in Manhattan, a disgruntled protester shouting about Hale Vision's environmental record and throwing a cold brew, had been spun by her father's office into a credible threat. He had recalled her immediately, and in her absence, her entire security posture had been upgraded. The familiar, aging guards she had known since childhood were gone, replaced by a new team of imposing men in dark suits. They were younger, faster, and utterly devoid of personality. They answered not to her, but to Cynthia Lorne, her father's recently appointed chief security advisor, a woman Lyra found unsettlingly ambitious. Lyra now felt less like a person and more like a high-value asset being moved, her every step monitored, her every interaction logged. This, she seethed, was her father's true motive, not protection, but control. She traced the outline of the small, simple silver locket at her throat, a nervous habit she'd had since she was a child. It was her mother's, the only piece of palpable warmth she owned, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world Elias had built. Her destination this morning was the downtown Hale Vision Tower, for a board meeting her father was forcing her to attend. She was to be seen, a united front. As she descended the main staircase, the new team leader, a man with flat gray eyes named Kincaid, motioned, and the front door was opened. The usual armored sedan was waiting, but her regular driver, a kind man named Samuel, was absent. "Mr. Harris is unwell today, Ms. Hale," Kincaid said, his voice as sterile as the marble floor. "A temporary replacement from the motor pool has been assigned." The replacement was Derek Rowan. He stood by the open rear door looking thoroughly out of place. He was 34, though the faint lines around his eyes suggested he'd seen more than most. His suit was clean but ill-fitting, straining slightly across a set of shoulders built for hauling equipment, not for chauffeuring heiresses. He was an ex-firefighter, the file had briefly noted, a single father. He met her gaze for only a second, a flicker of polite acknowledgement, before looking away. He held the door with a steady, capable hand, and Lyra slipped into the back, barely giving him a glance. He was temporary. He was staff. He was, like the trees and the gates, just part of the scenery. The power imbalance was a chasm. She was the mission. He was the function. The drive began in suffocating silence. Kincaid sat in the passenger seat, another new guard beside Lyra, his presence a heavy, unspoken threat. The tinted ballistic-grade windows turned the bright morning into a dull, gray smear. They moved through the private gates and onto the highway, a second follow car with 2 more guards taking up a defensive position behind them. Lyra stared out the window, frustration building into a cold anger. Her father was using this threat to leash her, to drag her back into the corporate fold she had fought so hard to escape. She checked her phone, intending to send another scathing text to her father's assistant, and frowned. No signal, not a single bar. She tapped the glass. It must be the new security shielding in the car, a rolling Faraday cage. The walls were closing in, quite literally. She looked up just as the sedan's turn signal blinked. They were taking an exit. "This isn't the way to the financial district," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the silence, sharp and authoritative. She knew this city. This was the exit for the old industrial port, miles of derelict warehouses and empty lots. Kincaid didn't even turn his head. "Reroute, Ms. Hale. An accident was reported on the viaduct. We are diverting." Lyra's stomach tightened. The excuse was too smooth, too practiced. The viaduct was the most direct route. She looked at the guard beside her. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw set. It was the driver who spoke. His voice was low, calm, and carried an unexpected weight. "Sir, the viaduct is clear. I checked the state traffic logs myself not 10 minutes ago." Derek Rowan's eyes met Lyra's in the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second. She saw it instantly. He knew. He was a local. He knew this route was wrong, and he knew the excuse was a lie. A heavy, dangerous silence filled the cabin. Kincaid slowly turned his head to look at the driver, his flat, gray eyes hardening. "Your job is to drive, Mr. Rowan, not to navigate. Follow the instructed route." Derek's hands tightened on the wheel. "My job," he said, his voice level, "is to ensure the principal's safety. This route is a breach of protocol. It leads to an unsecured zone. I am turning the vehicle around." He started to decelerate, easing the car toward the shoulder of the off-ramp. "You're relieved of that duty," Kincaid said, and his hand moved with frightening speed, not for a radio, but inside his jacket. At that exact same instant, Derek's eyes flicked to the side mirror. The follow car, the one supposedly protecting their rear, was accelerating, its engine roaring. It wasn't slowing down. It was closing the gap to ram them. He didn't wait for the gun. He didn't wait for the impact. He shouted one word, "Brace!" and wrenched the steering wheel hard to the left, slamming the sedan directly into the concrete median, a desperate, violent attempt to stop the car, to do anything other than be a willing passenger in his own execution. The world dissolved into the deafening shriek of metal tearing metal as the follow car smashed into their rear quarter panel, sending the 2-ton armored vehicle into a horrifying, bone-jarring spin. The world returned in a jagged metallic shriek. Derek didn't wait for the sedan to stop its grinding spin. Kincaid was already moving in the passenger seat, his eyes locked on Lyra, his weapon clearing its holster. Derek slammed his boot into the driver's side door, but the frame was warped, hopelessly jammed, and he twisted, unbuckling Lyra's harness with one violent pull. "Window! Cover your face!" He didn't have a tool. He used the only thing he had, his elbow, striking the reinforced ballistic glass with the full, desperate force of his 350 pounds of training. The glass, already fractured from the impact, spider-webbed into 1,000 pieces. He tore at the remaining shards with his bare hands, ignoring the sting, and grabbed the front of her expensive jacket. We go now! He hauled her out of the wreckage just as the follow car's doors burst open, the two guards moving with tactical precision. The shot from the hook, the one that hissed past, was aimed not at him, but directly at her. Stay behind me. It was a command, not a request. He shoved her toward the narrow gap between a brick warehouse and a collapsed chain-link fence. They ran, Lyra stumbling on the uneven pavement, her designer heels useless. He half-dragged, half-carried her into the labyrinth of the old industrial port. Gunfire echoed, flat and terrifying, behind them. He knew this area. He'd worked a few search and rescue drills here years ago. He spotted a corrugated steel door on a derelict auto body shop, its lock rusted and ancient. Using his firefighter's instinct for leverage, he slammed his shoulder against the weakest point, forcing the rusted mechanism to snap. They tumbled inside, into a cavernous darkness that smelled of rust, old tires, and cold, damp concrete. He slid the heavy door shut, plunging them into near-total blackness, the only illumination a few slivers of jaundiced light from a single, grime-caked window high above. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. Lyra's breath came in ragged, hyperventilating sobs. She scrambled away from him, pressing herself against a stack of moldering tires. "Who are you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a potent mix of terror and aristocratic rage. "You did this. You knew this route was wrong. You slowed down. You work for them, don't you? This was a kidnapping." She was looking for a weapon, her eyes darting around the filthy floor. Derek merely leaned against the door, his chest heaving, listening. He ignored her accusation, his focus entirely on the sounds outside, the distant traffic, the shouts of their pursuers growing fainter. They were searching, but they hadn't seen where the pair had gone. He waited a full 2 minutes before he finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "They weren't trying to kidnap you, Ms. Hale. They were trying to execute you. There's a difference." He turned, and in the dim light, she saw the dark, glistening slick of blood on his forearm, the same arm he'd used to clear the glass. He moved toward a rusted metal workbench, found an old dusty rag, and then located a plastic-wrapped first aid kit, the kind mandated in industrial shops decades ago. When he turned back toward her, she flinched. "Stay away from me." He stopped, his hands raised slightly, palms out. "You're hurt," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You have glass in your arm and a cut on your temple. Shock is a bigger threat than I am right now." He tossed the kit, and it landed at her feet. "Clean yourself up. We stay here until dark." Lyra stared at the kit, then at him. He wasn't acting like a kidnapper. He was acting like a first responder. Slowly, her hands shaking so badly she could barely break the plastic seal, she opened it. Derek slumped against the far wall, his own adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a dull ache. The air in the garage was stale, but the faint, lingering smell of gasoline and burnt rubber from the crash still clung to his clothes. He closed his eyes, the smell triggering a memory he fought to keep buried. "I was a firefighter," he said, his voice quiet, directed more at the darkness than at her. "For 12 years. Station 54. Lyra paused, a sterile wipe hovering over the cut on her arm. She said nothing. "The smell of a fire. You never get used to it," he continued, "but you learn to manage it. This smell, gasoline, burnt synthetics, it reminds me of the Westmoreland plant fire. 4 years ago." Lyra's head snapped up. "Westmoreland? I think I heard of that." "I'm sure you did. It was big news for a week." Derek's voice was flat, but a cold, hard anger resonated beneath it. "It was an electronics plant. Faulty wiring, the papers said. An accident. But the safety protocols were bypassed. The fire suppression system was offline. The exits were blocked by unfiled inventory. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes unreadable in the gloom. My wife was inside. Sarah. She was a line supervisor. I was on the rescue team that went in. We found her. We found all of them. Too late. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the garage. Lyra's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What does that have to do with me? He had the startup that owned the Westmoreland plant, Derek said, his voice dangerously level, was funded by Hale Vision Innovations. Your father's company. He financed the entire operation. Lyra felt the blood drain from her face. The suspicion returned, colder and sharper. And you just happened to get this job? Driving me? This is revenge. You're using this to get back at my father. She scrambled to her feet, clutching a tire iron she'd spotted. Derek looked at the iron, then back at her face, and for the first time, she saw not anger, but a profound, bottomless exhaustion. He didn't move. I didn't know who the principal was until I got the assignment this morning. I took this job because my daughter Emma needs dental surgery, and my pension doesn't cover it. I just needed the paycheck. He pushed himself off the wall and walked, not toward her, but toward the grimy window, careful to stay out of the sliver of light. I investigated that fire for 2 years on my own time. Your father's company cut corners. They pushed for a launch and people died. I have every reason in the world to hate the name Hale. He paused, looking at his hands, still stained with his own blood. But that wasn't you. You didn't sign the compliance waivers. And I spent 12 years pulling people out of fires, Ms. Hale. We don't stop to ask if they deserve it. When I saw that man, Kincaid, pull his weapon on you, I saw a victim, not a Hale. He turned back, his gaze meeting hers. The suspicion in her eyes hadn't vanished, but it was now competing with a new, confusing emotion. He had saved her life, twice, when he had every reason to let her die. The chasm between them, of class, of history, of power, remained, but a thin, fragile thread had just been cast across it. They will be hunting us, Derek said, his voice pulling her back to the immediate present. And they won't stop. We need a plan. They waited until the deep, suffocating quiet of 3 a.m., when the city had finally succumbed to an exhausted truce. The garage was frigid, the cold seeping up from the concrete, and Lyra found herself shivering, the adrenaline having long since abandoned her. Derek moved with a purpose that was both calming and terrifying. He had, at some point, found a small, rusted toolbox and retrieved a heavy-duty multi-tool. We have to go back, he said, his voice flat in the darkness. Lyra, who had been huddled near the cracked window, turned sharply. Back? Back to the crash? Are you insane? They'll be waiting for us. Derek shook his head, checking the tool's meager attachments. The police have already processed the scene. The bodies are gone. The scene is documented. It's just wreckage now. But it's wreckage that talks. Your car has an event data recorder, a black box. If we're going to prove what happened, I need it. He didn't wait for her agreement. He slid the heavy door open a fraction of an inch, peering into the alleyway for a full minute before nodding. Stay in the shadows. Do exactly as I say. Don't speak. The journey back was a waking nightmare. They moved through a maze of service alleys and desolate streets, the distant glow of the city painting the clouds an angry, artificial orange. Lyra, whose entire life had been spent shielded by armored cars and private security, was now a fugitive in her own city, hunted by the very men who wore her father's insignia. The power dynamic had been inverted so completely, it left her breathless. She, the heiress, was now utterly reliant on this temporary driver, a man whose wife her father's company had, however indirectly, killed. The tension was a living thing between them, a barbed wire of mistrust and necessity. The crash site was eerily silent, cordoned off with flapping yellow police tape. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows over the glass-strewn pavement. The two vehicles were still there, twisted monuments of black steel, waiting for the city's tow trucks to claim them in the morning. "Wait here," Derek ordered, pointing to the deep shadow of a doorway. He moved like a ghost, slipping under the tape, his previous career as a firefighter evident in his efficient, practiced movements. He knew how vehicles were built, and he knew how they came apart. Lyra watched, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, as he crouched by the driver's side of the ruined sedan. He didn't use force. He used technique, his hands disappearing under the ravaged dashboard. Less than 90 seconds later, he was back, melting into the shadows beside her, a small, unassuming metal box in his hand. This was the payoff for his specialized knowledge, a piece of evidence no one else would have thought to retrieve. He led her onto the subway, the rattling, fluorescent-lit car filled with the city's ghosts. A few night shift workers and the homeless, all ignoring each other. They rode it for 40 minutes, transferring twice, until they surfaced in a neighborhood Lyra had only ever seen from a distance. He took her to a small, 24-hour diner that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. A man sat in the furthest booth, his back to the wall, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. He was built like Derek, solid and weary, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced, cynical gaze. "Marcus," Derek said, sliding into the booth. Lyra slipped in beside him, feeling exposed. "This is him?" she whispered. Derek nodded. "Marcus Cole. We came up together. He's IA. He trusts the system even less than I do." Marcus looked from Derek to Lyra, his expression grim. "You look like hell, Rowan. And you," he said to Lyra, "look like you're a long way from home, Ms. Hale. This is a mess. The entire force is on alert. You're not listed as a victim. You're listed as missing and endangered." Derek placed the EDR on the table. "They tried to kill her, Marcus. Her own team. This came from inside Hale Vision. I need you to pull the data." Marcus sighed, plugging the box into a ruggedized tablet he pulled from a backpack. "I already pulled the internal memos, Derek. The narrative is that you, the disgruntled ex-firefighter whose wife died in a Hale-funded operation, kidnapped the heiress during a violent, opportunistic attack by a rival corporation." Lyra's blood ran cold. "They're framing him?" The tablet chimed. Marcus's eyes scanned the data. "Well," he said, his voice hardening, "the black box doesn't agree." He turned the screen. The reroute command wasn't an override. It wasn't an external hack. It was an authenticated system directive pushed from inside the Hale Vision Central Security Network. The GPS was manipulated, yes, but with a valid high-level clearance key. This wasn't a kidnapping, Derek. This was a sanctioned execution, disguised as a diversion. Lyra felt the air leave her lungs. "My father," she breathed. "He's the only one with that level of clearance." "Maybe," Marcus said, his cop's skepticism kicking in. "Or maybe he's just the patsy." He swiped the screen, bringing up a video file. "This was leaked to 2 major news outlets about an hour after your crash." It was grainy security footage from a parking garage, time-stamped 2 days prior. It clearly showed her father, Elias Hale, in a violent, face-to-face confrontation with the CEO of Aris Dynamics, their chief competitor. The Aris CEO shoved her father. Elias lunged back, jabbing a finger in the man's chest, his face purple with rage. The red herring was planted perfectly. "Aris is attempting a hostile takeover," Marcus explained quietly. "This video makes them the perfect suspect for attacking the heir. It destabilizes Hale Vision and makes Aris look like corporate terrorists." Lyra's mind was spinning. The video, the internal command, the disgruntled employee narrative. It was all too neat, too clean. "So which is it?" she asked. "Did Aris attack me, or did my father?" Marcus shook his head, pointing at the EDR data. "Neither. The hit was internal. The Ara's video is a diversion, a red herring. Someone inside Hale Vision wanted you dead, and they wanted it to look like either Eris or your new driver did it. They had all their bases covered. He leaned forward. This isn't just about security, Ms. Hale. I've been hearing whispers. This is about politics. Internal Hale Vision politics. Someone is making a power play, trying to seize control of the company. And to do that, they needed to eliminate the heir. Lyra's hand went instinctively to her throat, her fingers closing around the cold, familiar metal of her mother's locket. She was a chess piece, and she had just been violently swept from the board. Marcus Cole had provided them with a 20-year-old pickup truck that looked like it hadn't been washed since the last Bush administration. Its engine rumbling with a low, reassuring cough. It was perfect. They drove for nearly 2 hours, Derek handling the truck with an easy familiarity, his gaze constantly sweeping the mirrors. They left the city, then the suburbs, pushing deep into the forested county roads where streetlights gave way to the pale, indifferent glow of the moon. Lyra, wrapped in a threadbare blanket Marcus had tossed in the back, watched the dense pine trees slide by like an impenetrable wall. The paranoia of the last 24 hours had settled into her bones, a cold, heavy ache. She was a ghost, erased from her own life, and the only person on Earth who knew she was alive was the man gripping the wheel, the man whose past her family had helped to destroy. The truck turned onto a gravel path, the tires crunching loudly in the silence, and finally pulled up to a small, dark shape nestled in the trees, a single-story A-frame cabin, plumes of wood smoke curling from its chimney. "This is it," Derek said, his voice softer than she'd heard it. "This is home." The word hung in the air, foreign and strange. Home, to Lyra, was a sterile expanse of glass and automated security. This place smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and burning oak. Derek cut the engine, and the silence of the forest rushed in. He didn't move for a moment, just listening. "We're safe here," he said, more to himself than to her. "No one knows about this place except Marcus." He led her inside, and the warmth hit her first, a dry, enveloping heat from a cast-iron stove in the corner. The cabin was one large room, cluttered but meticulously clean. It was the absolute antithesis of her father's mansion. Every surface was covered in evidence of a life lived, half-finished cups of tea, stacks of worn paperbacks, mismatched furniture, and on the sofa, curled under a quilt, was a small, sleeping form, a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whistle. Derek's entire posture changed. The tense, hardened first responder dissolved, replaced by something softer, something Lyra couldn't name. He moved to the couch, his heavy boots silent on the wooden floor, and knelt, brushing a lock of brown hair off the girl's face. "Hey, monkey," he whispered. "Dad's home." The girl, Emma, stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, her face split into a sleepy, ecstatic grin. "Daddy!" She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his jacket. "You're late. I waited." Derek hugged her fiercely, his eyes closing. "I know, Em. I'm sorry. I had to help someone. This is Lyra. She's going to stay with us for a little while." Emma peered at Lyra from the safety of her father's arms, her eyes wide and curious. Lyra, who had never known what to do with children, managed a weak, exhausted smile. Derek carried his daughter toward a small adjoining bedroom, and Lyra was left alone in the main room, an interloper in this sanctuary of warmth. She felt a profound, alien ache. This was fatherhood, not directives and security teams, but whispered apologies and the smell of wood smoke. Lyra's eyes drifted to the refrigerator, which was covered in a chaotic, colorful collage of children's artwork. She saw drawings of flowers, a clumsy but recognizable portrait of Derek in his firefighter's uniform, and a drawing of a smiling sun. But her gaze snagged on one, held by a chipped magnet. A large rectangular building, drawn in black crayon, with angry chaotic swirls of red, orange, and yellow erupting from the windows. It was a crude, childlike depiction, but its subject was unmistakable. It was a building on fire. A new, cold dread settled over her, a premonition she couldn't yet articulate. This was the plant. The fire wasn't just Derek's past. It was Emma's, too. Derek returned, his expression softening as he saw her looking at the fridge. "Emma, she draws what she dreams about," he said quietly. He walked to the small kitchen counter, retrieving a kettle. She was 2 when Sarah died. She doesn't remember her, but sometimes I think she remembers the fire. He didn't elaborate. He busied himself with making tea, his movements economical. Lyra watched the man who yesterday had been nothing more than a temporary employee. He was competent, calm, and knew how to make a 7-year-old feel safe. He was a man who knew how to make pancakes and, she suspected, teach a child to draw. He was everything the men in her life were not. The lull in the action was unsettling. It gave her time to think and to feel the full, crushing weight of her isolation. She sat at the small, worn wooden table, her hands wrapped around the hot mug, the steam warming her face. Her hand, a reflex she'd had since childhood, went to the locket at her throat. She rubbed the smooth silver, the one constant thing in her life, the last gift from her mother. She twisted it idly, her nerves frayed, her mind racing. Why? Why would her father— No, Marcus had said it was internal. Someone else. But who? She twisted the locket again, harder this time, her fingers digging into the ornate clasp. And then, for the first time in the 15 years she had worn it, she felt a tiny, mechanical click. She froze. The mug stopped halfway to her lips. She looked down. Her fingers had caught a nearly invisible seam along the locket's edge. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This wasn't just a locket. It was a container. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the minuscule catch, her nails scraping against the metal. It popped open, but inside, there was no faded, miniature portrait of her mother. There was only a tiny, black and silver object, nestled in custom-cut foam. A micro USB drive. Her mother had left this for her. But why? She looked at Derek, who was now on the small porch, his back to her, silhouetted against the pre-dawn light. Keeping watch, she didn't call him. This was her mother's secret. This was a Hale secret. She spotted an old, battered laptop on a desk piled high with bills and manuals. Moving quietly, she retrieved it, booted it up, and slid the drive into the port. A single folder appeared. Inside, one audio file. The title made her blood run cold. Elias Cynthia Westmoreland, M4A. She found a pair of tangled earbuds on the desk and pressed play. She heard the sound of a heavy office door closing. Then, a voice she recognized instantly. Cynthia Lorne, her father's chief security advisor. Her voice was not the smooth, professional tone Lyra knew. It was cold, sharp, and utterly dominant. "And the families are quiet for now, Elias. But the Westmoreland accident can't be contained indefinitely. The EPA is starting to sniff around the soil samples. You will sign the new compliance initiative, and you will backdate it." Then, her father's voice. But it wasn't the powerful, booming voice of the CEO. It was the voice of a man, cornered, exhausted. "This is not compliance, Cynthia. This is a felony. You are asking me to bury the initial engineering reports. You're asking me to retroactively blame the victims for operational negligence." Cynthia's laugh was a cold, sharp sound. "I am asking you to save this company. Your company. The one I've spent 10 years protecting while you played the visionary. I cleaned up your messes, Elias. All of them. Now you will sign this. Or—" There was a pause, the sound of paper shuffling. The board will finally hear about the aggressive procurement strategies you used to secure the New York expansion. The ones that nearly bankrupted us. The ones I personally covered up. A long, heavy silence. Then her father's voice, barely a whisper. You are blackmailing me. In my own office. Cynthia's reply was the last thing on the recording. I am ensuring loyalty. The file is on your desk. Sign it by morning. We have too much to lose. The recording ended with the sharp click of the door closing. Lyra sat back, the earbuds falling from her ears, the cabin's warmth suddenly gone. Her father wasn't the monster. He was a prisoner. And Cynthia Lorne, the woman who had upgraded her security team, was the one holding the keys. The audio file clicked off, and the silence that rushed into the cabin was heavier and more toxic than the air in the garage. Lyra sat paralyzed, the plastic earbuds dangling from her fingers. The locket, her mother's last gift, felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight against her chest. It wasn't a token of love. It was a weapon. A ticking time bomb her mother had armed and left for her to find. Cynthia Lorne. The name echoed in the tiny, warm cabin, a blast of Arctic cold. The polite, ambitious COO who had always smiled too readily. The woman her father had trusted. The woman who had ordered her execution. Her father wasn't the monster. He was the first victim, a prisoner in his own empire, blackmailed into silence by the very fire that had orphaned Derek's daughter. Derek stepped back inside, his boots silent on the wood floor. He had been scanning the perimeter, but he stopped when he saw her face. It was the color of ash. Lyra? What is it? What did you find? She couldn't speak. She just looked at him, her eyes wide with a new, crystallized terror, and held out the earbuds. He didn't ask again. He took them from her trembling hand, plugged them into the old laptop, and pressed play. Lyra watched his face, a mask of forced calm. She watched his jaw muscles bunch, knotting into steel. She watched his hands, resting on the table, slowly clench into white-knuckled fists, his short, clean nails digging into his own palms. He listened to the entire damning conversation. He heard Cynthia's cold blackmail. He heard Elias Hale's defeated concession. He heard the proof that the Westmoreland fire, the fire that had incinerated his wife, was not an accident, but a criminal conspiracy. When the file ended, he didn't move for a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the crackle of the wood stove. She orchestrated it, he said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, a low, controlled rumble. She engineered the cover-up. My wife and the others. They didn't die because of faulty wiring. They died because of that contract. He looked at Lyra, and for the first time, she saw no anger directed at her, no trace of the chasm between them. She saw only a shared, terrible clarity. Cynthia promoted the new security team, Lyra said, the words tumbling out. She controlled the route. Kincaid. The ambush. It was all her. She was cleaning house. My mother must have recorded this, and Cynthia must have found out. Or suspected. Or she just got impatient, Derek finished, his mind racing, the firefighter's tactical brain assessing the blaze. The Ares takeover. The video of your father. That was her insurance. A diversion. She'd hit you, blame Ares, and use the chaos to force your father out, seizing control. But you survived. And now you have this. He tapped the laptop. You're not just the heir. You're the one witness who can burn her to the ground. The red herring of Elias Hale evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard truth. The trust between them was no longer a fragile thread. It was a steel cable, forged in their shared history of fire and loss. We have to get this out, Lyra said, a new hard resolve in her voice. We have to get this to Marcus, to the media. We have to show them what she did. Derek was already moving, grabbing a small backpack from a peg by the door. The laptop battery won't last. The truck's charger is unreliable. We go to Marcus. We use his secure network. We can't do it from here. He looked at the door to Emma's room, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. She's safer here. Mrs. Petrov, 2 cabins over, checks on her every morning. This is our fight. Let's go. He grabbed the keys from a hook. Lyra slid the precious laptop into her bag, the locket now tucked safely inside her shirt. They burst from the cabin door into the thin gray light of dawn. The air was sharp, cold. Derek moved toward the truck, his senses on high alert. He slid the key into the door, and as the truck's cab light flickered on, the old AM radio crackled to life, still tuned to the local news broadcast he used to check the weather. A voice, smooth and professional, cut through the morning silence. Developing story this morning. Sources inside Hale Vision have confirmed that Lyra Hale, the corporation's 27-year-old heiress, is suffering from severe psychological distress and paranoia following yesterday's violent highway incident. Lyra froze, her hand on the passenger door. What did he just say? Derek's face went grim. He turned the volume up. A company-wide bulletin warns that she may be erratic and is considered a danger to herself. This comes as police name a person of interest in her abduction. Derek Rowan, 34, a disgruntled former city employee who, in a tragic twist, lost his wife in a 2021 fire linked to a Hale Vision subsidiary. Lyra felt the ground drop out from under her. She did it, she whispered, horrified. She's turned me into a mental patient. And you. She's turned you into the villain. Derek's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the dense tree line at the edge of the gravel path. She's not just controlling the narrative, he said, his voice a low growl. She's boxing us in. She's painting us as a hysterical victim and a vengeful kidnapper. No one will listen to us. No one will believe us. He wasn't just a driver anymore. He was a target. And she wasn't an heiress. She was cargo. As if summoned by the radio broadcast, a vehicle appeared. It wasn't a police car. It was a black, sterile sedan, identical to Kincaid's, its engine a low, predatory hum as it rolled onto the gravel path, blocking their only exit. The doors opened. 2 men in dark, tactical gear stepped out. They were not the guards from the crash. These were new. Their faces were impassive, their movements clinical. They were not here to rescue. They were here to retrieve. "Get back in the house!" Derek shouted, shoving Lyra behind him. "The back room with Emma! Bolt the door!" Lyra stumbled back, her heart exploding against her ribs. "Derek, no! You can't!" He didn't look at her. "Go! Protect the drive! Protect my daughter!" He didn't run. He stood his ground between the men and the cabin, his hands empty. He was buying her seconds. "Mr. Rowan," one of the men called, his voice unnervingly polite, holding a firearm at a low-ready position. "We are here for Ms. Hale. The COO has authorized us to meet any resistance with lethal force. Stand down." Derek's eyes flashed to the woodpile by the porch. "Go to hell," he spat. As Lyra slammed the heavy cabin door and fumbled for the bolt, she heard the sickening, wet crack of a silenced gunshot. Then a heavy thud. She screamed, "Derek!" She scrambled to the small kitchen window, peering out. Derek was on the ground. He wasn't dead. He had dived, grabbing a heavy split log from the woodpile and sweeping the legs of the first man. He was on his feet in a second, slamming the log into the second man's chest with a roar. He was a firefighter, trained to move in chaos. But he had a log, and they had guns. The first man, recovering, raised his pistol. A shot. Not a crack, but a high-pitched, electric hiss. A taser. Derek arched in agony as the current ripped through him, collapsing to his knees, the log falling from his numb fingers. The man with the pistol advanced on him, kicking him viciously in the ribs. She ran into the deep, dark safety of the woods, the sound of her own name, roared by a dying hero, echoing behind her. The two tactical operators were not police. They were private contractors, and they weren't paid to fight cops. They exchanged a look. One fired a single, suppressing shot toward Marcus, the bullet pinging off the truck's grill. "Forget the girl. Grab the target. We're out." They grabbed Derek, who was semi-conscious and bleeding profusely from his side, and hauled his dead weight toward their sedan. They weren't arresting him. They were taking their one loose end. "No!" Lyra screamed, breaking cover. Marcus saw her. "Lyra, stay down!" He fired twice, aiming for the sedan's tires. The rear window exploded. The driver panicked, flooring the accelerator. The sedan fishtailed, its back door still open, and sped down the gravel path, disappearing onto the main road, taking Derek with it. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by Emma's terrified sobs. Lyra sank to her knees, the rock falling from her hand. He was gone. She had the evidence, but Cynthia had the only man who believed her. "It's not over," Marcus said, his voice grim as he holstered his weapon and moved to Lyra, pulling her to her feet. "They'll take him somewhere quiet. They'll try to get the drive. When they realize he doesn't have it, they'll finish the job." He looked at Lyra, his eyes hard. "She's cleaning up, which means her plan is in motion. Right now." Lyra's mind, fractured by terror, suddenly snapped into focus. "The shareholder meeting," she said, her voice a dead, cold monotone. "It's today. The global broadcast. It's her coronation." Marcus nodded. "Then we're going to crash the party." Lyra, sitting in the back, was no longer an heiress. She wore a simple black turtleneck, her hair pulled back, her face scrubbed clean. She looked like a ghost. "Cynthia's broadcast is being routed through the main AV control room, sub-level 2, Derek said, his voice strained. "She'll have her own men on the door, but she won't have men in the server conduit." He pointed to a schematic on his screen. "This vent leads from the garage, past the server room, and opens into a maintenance crawlspace behind the AV booth. It's a 3-foot duct. Dark, tight, but it'll get you there." He met her eyes. "You'll have to go alone." Lyra nodded. She had crawled from a burning car. She could crawl through a vent. She placed the micro USB drive, the locket, and her laptop into a small backpack. "When I'm in," she said, "I'm patching the laptop into the main broadcast feed. It'll override everything. Be ready. Hail Vision is stable. The future is secure." "Now, Lyra," Derek's voice crackled in her ear. Lyra ripped the panel off the main router, found the master input, and jammed her laptop's connection cable into the port. In the auditorium, the 100-foot screen behind Cynthia sputtered. Her polished smile faltered. The screen went black. And then, the audio file. Cynthia's own voice, cold and sharp, boomed through the auditorium. "Elias, but the Westmoreland accident can't be contained indefinitely. The EPA is starting to sniff around." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Cynthia's face went white. "Shut it down!" she shrieked at the AV booth. "Cut the feed!" But the technicians were frozen, staring in horror as her voice continued to echo, detailing the blackmail, the cover-up. He saw her look straight into the main broadcast camera. A message he knew was meant only for him. "It's all right, Derek," she said, her voice carrying over the global feed, firm and in command. "Stay behind me. I'll handle this." The corporation, under Lyra's guidance, was systematically paying its debts. Derek Rowan stood near the pumper, a coffee mug in hand, his work shirt clean, his posture relaxed. The deep, vicious wound in his side had healed into a puckered, angry scar, a permanent reminder of his choice. He was no longer a temporary driver, nor was he the haunted shell of a firefighter. He was the chief, the manager, and the heart of this small station, training a new class of local volunteers. He watched as Lyra, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, knelt on a canvas dropcloth. She wore jeans and a paint-spattered sweatshirt, a universe away from the armored heiress he had pulled from the wreck. Beside her, Emma, chattering happily, was meticulously painting a large, colorful mural on the station's inner wall. It was not a drawing of a building on fire. It was a sprawling oak tree, its branches filled with portraits of the families in their small community. Lyra, laughing, dipped a small brush in yellow paint and handed it to Emma. Okay, now the sun, right at the top. She had become a regular fixture here, not as a benefactor, but as a volunteer. She sorted paperwork, organized community outreach, and, most importantly, she showed up. She was learning to build, not just to inherit. The bond between the three of them had settled from a fragile, trauma-forged alliance into a quiet, unspoken norm. They were, for in the most unexpected way, a family. This was the true reward, not the headlines proclaiming Lyra Hale the new ethical face of corporate America, nor the long prison sentences handed down to Cynthia Lorne and her conspirators. It was this, the simple, uncomplicated sound of a child's laughter in a place that should have been defined by loss. Derek stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold, pine-scented air. Lyra followed, handing him a fresh mug of tea. They stood in silence for a moment, partners, equals. "Tomorrow is the last day of the civil trials," he said quietly, looking out at the dark woods. "The final victim impact statements. It will be a lot. The press will be there. A mob." Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the same dark horizon. "I know." Derek turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the window. "You don't have to face them alone, Lyra. I'll be there. Just stay behind me. I can run interference."